The sun bore down on San Jose, California, like an unforgiving judge as Xander Lowell rode into town, dust clinging to his worn leather chaps and sweat-dampened shirt. It was 1875, and the promise of new beginnings that had lured him westward now felt as hollow as the hungry feeling in his gut. 3 days without proper food had left him desperate for work, but the whispers that followed him into town suggested his reputation had somehow arrived before him. "That's him," a woman's voice carried on the wind. "The cowboy they say caused the Miller family wagon crash up north." Xander tipped his hat lower, his jaw tightening. He hadn't even been anywhere near Stockton when that accident happened, yet somehow his name had become attached to the tragedy that had left 3 dead and a young woman orphaned. It was the kind of rumor that could destroy a man in the West, where reputation was sometimes all a person had. He guided his chestnut mare toward the livery stable, planning to stable her before seeking work or at least a meal. The stable boy, barely 14, with a face full of freckles, eyed him warily. "2 bits a day," the boy said, not meeting Xander's eyes. "Feeds extra." Xander handed over the coins, noting how carefully the boy avoided touching his hand. "I'll be back before sundown." "Treat her well, she's carried me through worse than rumors." The boy's eyes widened, but he said nothing as Xander turned and walked toward the main street. San Jose was growing quickly, positioned nicely between the gold country and the coast, offering both opportunities and fresh starts. Or so he'd hoped. He pushed through the batwing doors of the Painted Lady Saloon, momentarily relishing the cooler air inside. The midday crowd was sparse: a few card players, an old-timer nursing a whiskey at the bar, and a woman sweeping the floor with determined strokes. It was the woman who caught his eye. Her dress was practical, not the finery of a saloon girl, and she moved with purpose, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun. When she glanced up, Xander found himself looking into eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. "Help you, mister?" She asked, her tone neither friendly nor hostile. "Looking for work," Xander replied, "and maybe some information. Bar's there. Barkeep's name is Morgan. He hires hands from time to time." She returned to her sweeping, but Xander noticed how her eyes flicked up to study him when she thought he wasn't looking. He approached the bar where the barkeep was polishing glasses with a threadbare rag. "Passing through or staying?" the man asked without preamble. "Depends on what's available," Xander replied. "Need an honest day's work." The barkeep Morgan studied him for a long moment. "Name?" "Xander Lowell." Morgan's hand stilled on the glass. "Lowell, you say?" His voice had cooled considerably. "Heard that name recently." "I imagine you have," Xander said evenly, "and whatever you heard is wrong." The sweeping behind him had stopped. Xander could feel the woman listening, though he didn't turn to look at her. "That's so," Morgan said. "Because what I heard is that a cowboy named Lowell spooked a team of horses on the Stockton Road, causing a wagon to go over the ridge, killed a family, all except the daughter." "Like I said," Xander responded, keeping his voice steady, "what you heard is wrong. I was 50 miles away when that happened, working cattle for the Barrett Ranch." "Barrett's, huh? That's easy enough to check." Morgan resumed his polishing. "Until then, I got no work for you." Xander nodded once, accepting the temporary defeat. As he turned to leave, he found himself face to face with the woman who'd been sweeping. Up close, he could see the gold flecks in her amber eyes and the slight dusting of freckles across her nose. "The Millers," she said quietly. "That was the family in the wagon crash." "Yes, madam," he replied. "A tragedy, but not one of my making." She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he held her gaze. "I'm Sarah Linden," she said finally. "The Millers were my aunt, uncle, and cousin." The air seemed to leave Xander's lungs. Of all the saloons in all the towns, he'd walked into the one where the surviving Millers family worked. "Miss Linden, I save it," she said, not unkindly. "If you're innocent as you claim, you'll get the chance to prove it. If not," she let the sentence hang. "If not, I wouldn't have ridden into the very town where the family had connections," he finished for her. "I'm not a fool, Miss Linden." Something flickered in her eyes, not quite belief, but perhaps the willingness to consider it. "The ranch hands from the double cross will be in tonight." They were the ones who found the wreckage. You might want to hear what they have to say." "I'll be here," Xander promised. "Thank you, Miss Linden." She nodded once before returning to her sweeping, and Xander stepped back into the blinding California sun with more hope than he'd had when he entered. If the double-cross hands had been first on the scene, perhaps they'd seen something that could clear his name. Xander spent the afternoon making inquiries about room and board, eventually securing a small attic room above the general store for a reasonable rate. The storekeeper, a plump woman named Mrs. Henderson, didn't seem to have heard the rumors about him, or if she had, she kept her thoughts to herself. "We don't get many strangers staying long," she said as she showed him the sparse room with its narrow bed and wash basin. "Most folks are either passing through to the coast or heading east to try their luck in the gold fields." "I'm hoping to find work," Xander told her. "Maybe put down some roots." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Well, there's always work for a strong back in San Jose. The orchards are expanding and the ranches need hands." As dusk approached, Xander made his way back to the Painted Lady. The saloon had filled considerably since midday with ranch hands, merchants, and a few well-dressed men he took to be local businessmen. He spotted Sarah moving efficiently between tables, serving drinks and exchanging brief pleasantries with the patrons. He found a corner table where he could observe the room and ordered a beer when Sarah approached. Her eyes met his briefly, and she nodded toward a group of men wearing the dust of the trail. "Double-cross hands," she said quietly. "The one with the red bandana is Hank Dawson. He was in charge of the men who found the wagon." "Thank you," Xander said, genuinely grateful for her help despite her obvious reservations about him. Sarah hesitated, then leaned closer. "Why does it matter so much to you, clearing your name in a town you've never been to before?" "Because the truth matters," Xander replied simply. "And because a lie that follows you is like a wolf at your heels sooner or later, it catches up." She studied him again with those perceptive eyes before moving on to the next table. Xander sipped his beer slowly, waiting for the right moment to approach Dawson. That moment came sooner than expected when the man himself approached Xander's table. "You Lowell?" Dawson asked without preamble, his weathered face unreadable. "I am," Xander confirmed, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Understand you were first to find the Miller wagon." Dawson took the offered seat, his eyes never leaving Xander's face. "We were. Nasty business. Team went wild, wagon went over the edge, found tracks of another horse nearby." "Not my horse," Xander said firmly. "I was working Barrett's ranch that day." Dawson took a long pull of his whiskey. "So I heard when I asked around. Barrett's foreman vouches for you, says you were breaking horses when the accident happened." Relief washed over Xander, followed quickly by confusion. "Then why am I still being blamed?" "Because someone who looks like you was seen riding away from the scene," Dawson replied. "And because people need someone to blame when tragedy strikes." Across the room, Xander noticed Sarah watching their conversation intently while pretending to wipe down the bar. Her eyes met his for a brief moment before she looked away. "Who started the rumor it was me?" Xander asked, turning back to Dawson. "Fellow named Blackwell. Emmett Blackwell. He's got land adjoining the Miller's property, been trying to buy them out for years, from what I hear." The name meant nothing to Xander, but he filed it away. "Appreciate the information, Dawson. Can I buy you another drink?" Dawson nodded, and they spent the next hour talking cattle and horses. By the time the ranch hand left to join his companions, Xander had confirmed two critical facts. He had an alibi for the day of the accident, and someone who resembled him was potentially being used as a convenient scapegoat. As the night wore on, the saloon gradually emptied until only a few dedicated drinkers remained. Sarah approached his table as she collected empty glasses. "Heard enough?" she asked, her voice low. "Enough to know someone's lying about me," Xander replied, "but not enough to understand why." Sarah glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "Emmett Blackwell has been trying to expand his ranch for years. The Miller's land has the best water access in the county. They refused to sell. And now they're dead," Xander said grimly, "and the property will go to." Me, Sarah confirmed. I'm the only living relative, and Blackwell made an offer the day after the funeral. Xander watched her face carefully. You didn't take it, she shook her head. Something felt wrong, and now, she met his gaze directly. Now I need to know what really happened to my family. The vulnerability in her eyes stirred something in Xander's chest. Miss Linden, I give you my word I had nothing to do with what happened to your family, but I'll help you find out who did. Sarah's lips curved in the barest hint of a smile. Why would you do that? You don't know me. Because we both want the same thing, Xander said simply. The truth. She studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Meet me tomorrow at dawn behind the livery. We'll ride out to the ranch. She gathered the last of the glasses and turned to go, then paused. And Mr. Lowell, come armed. The warning lingered in Xander's mind as he made his way back to his rented room. Whatever had happened to the Millers, it clearly wasn't a simple accident. And if Sarah's suspicions about Blackwell were correct, the man wouldn't welcome their investigation. Sleep came fitfully that night, with dreams of runaway wagons and amber eyes that seemed to see right through him. Dawn found Xander waiting behind the livery, his mare saddled and his Winchester rifle securely in its scabbard. He'd checked and rechecked his Colt revolver, making sure it was clean and loaded. The morning air was cool, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Sarah arrived punctually, riding a sturdy bay gelding and dressed in men's riding trousers beneath a split-skirt practical attire that spoke of a woman accustomed to ranch life. Her hair was braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Borrowed the horse from Morgan, she explained as she approached. He doesn't know where I'm going. Probably wise, Xander agreed. How far to the Miller place? About 2 hours' ride north, Sarah replied. We should reach it by mid-morning. They set out in silence, following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling hills covered in golden grass. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah gradually opened up about her family. My aunt and uncle moved here from Ohio in '65, she explained. Started with nothing but built up a decent cattle operation. Their son, my cousin Thomas, was just 17. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. I'm sorry for your loss, Xander said quietly. Sarah nodded, collecting herself. I came out to join them last year after my parents passed. They were good people, Mr. Lowell. They didn't deserve what happened to them. No one does, Xander agreed. And it's Xander, please. She glanced at him with a hint of a smile. Xander, then, and I'm Sarah, not Miss Linden. As they crested a rise, Sarah pointed to a distant cluster of buildings nestled in a valley beside a creek. That's it, the Miller Ranch. They approached cautiously, Xander scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement or danger. The ranch appeared deserted, with an eerie stillness hanging over the main house and outbuildings. No one's been taking care of the place, Xander asked as they dismounted in the yard. Sarah shook her head. The hands all left after the accident. I haven't had the heart to come back until now. The main house was a solidly built structure with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Inside, everything was exactly as the Millers had left it, dishes still on the table, books open on side tables, a half-finished piece of knitting in a basket by the rocking chair. Sarah moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching objects gently as if confirming they were real. Where did the accident happen? Xander asked gently. About a mile north of here, Sarah replied. They were coming back from town. They remounted and followed Sarah's lead along a ridge that overlooked a steep ravine. Eventually, she reined in her horse and pointed down. There, she said quietly. Xander dismounted and approached the edge carefully. Below, he could see the remains of the wagon, its wooden frame shattered against the rocks. The horses were long gone, either dead or run off. He studied the ground carefully, looking for any clues that might have been missed. The tracks should still be visible, he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. She joined him at the edge. What tracks? Dawson mentioned tracks of another horse near the scene, Xander explained. If someone deliberately spooked the team, they would have been riding. They made their way carefully down the slope, following a game trail that zigzagged to the bottom of the ravine. The wreckage was worse up close: splintered wood, torn leather, and dark stains on the rocks that Xander knew were blood. Sarah's face had gone pale, but her steps were determined as she moved among the debris. "Here," Xander called, kneeling beside a flat patch of ground. "Horse tracks heading away from the scene." He examined them closely. Horse was shod and carrying a heavy rider. "And look," he pointed to a distinctive mark in one of the prints. "This horse has a chip in its right front shoe, makes a mark like a half moon." Sarah knelt beside him. "Can you tell which direction they went?" Xander followed the tracks for several yards. "Back toward town, it looks like. But then they veer east." He glanced up at the ridge above them. "Toward the neighboring property, Blackwell's ranch," Sarah confirmed, her expression hardening. They spent another hour examining the scene before making their way back up to their horses. As they mounted, Xander noticed Sarah's hands trembling slightly. "We don't have proof it was Blackwell," he cautioned gently. "Not yet," she agreed. "But we know someone deliberately rode close to the wagon, close enough to spook the team." They rode in contemplative silence for a while before Xander spoke again. "We need to find the horse with the chipped shoe. That's our best evidence." Sarah nodded. "Blackwell has at least 20 horses. We can't just walk onto his property and start checking their hooves." "No, but we can ask around town," Xander suggested. "The blacksmith would know which horses he's shod recently and if any had distinctive marks." They altered their course slightly, heading back toward San Jose rather than returning to the Miller Ranch. The sun was high overhead, beating down mercilessly as they rode. "How did you come to be a cowboy?" Sarah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Xander smiled faintly. "My father ran cattle in Texas. I grew up on horseback, learned everything from him until he passed when I was 16. Been riding from ranch to ranch ever since, wherever the work takes me." "No home of your own, not yet," he admitted. "Always thought I'd find the right place and settle down someday. Start my own ranch, maybe." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "And what would make a place right?" "Good water," he replied without hesitation. "Decent grazing land, and—" He paused, considering a reason to stay. Their eyes met briefly before Sarah looked away. "Well, San Jose has plenty of good water and grazing land," she said lightly, "and reasons." Xander asked, surprising himself with his boldness. Sarah's cheeks colored slightly, but her response was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. They both reined in, listening intently. "Riders coming," Xander said, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "From the east." They guided their horses into a stand of oak trees, watching as 3 horsemen appeared on the trail ahead. Xander recognized the man in front immediately from Sarah's sharp intake of breath. "Blackwell," she whispered. Emmett Blackwell was a large man with a thick gray beard and an imposing presence even from a distance. His companions were clearly hired guns, with the hard eyes and alert postures of men accustomed to violence. "They're heading toward the Miller Ranch," Xander observed. "Why would Blackwell be going there now?" "Let's follow them," Sarah suggested, her jaw set in determination. "Find out what he's looking for." They waited until the riders had passed before emerging from their hiding place, maintaining a cautious distance as they trailed behind. The 3 men rode directly to the Miller Ranch and dismounted in the yard. Blackwell entered the main house while his men began searching the outbuildings. Xander and Sarah left their horses concealed behind a low hill and crept closer on foot, using the tall grass for cover. They reached the barn just as one of Blackwell's men was emerging. "Nothing in here, boss," the man called out. "No sign of the papers. Keep looking," Blackwell's voice boomed from the house. "They have to be here somewhere. Check the foreman's cabin." Sarah frowned, whispering to Xander, "What papers is he talking about?" "Land deed, maybe," Xander suggested. "Or something that would prove his claim invalid." They watched as the men continued their search, growing increasingly frustrated as they came up empty-handed. Finally, Blackwell emerged from the house, his face thunderous. "That Linden woman must have them," he growled. "We need to find her before she realizes what she has." Sarah tensed beside Xander, her hand reflexively moving to the small revolver hidden in her jacket pocket. Xander placed a restraining hand on her arm, shaking his head in warning. They were outnumbered and outgunned. As Blackwell and his men mounted up to leave, one of the horses, a sturdy gray gelding, shifted nervously. and Xander caught a glimpse of its front hoof. The distinctive half-moon mark was clearly visible. "That's the horse," he whispered to Sarah. "The gray Blackwell's man is riding, same mark as the tracks at the ravine." Sarah's eyes widened, then narrowed with renewed determination. "We need to get back to town," she said. "Fast." They retreated carefully to their horses and mounted up, taking a different trail back to San Jose to avoid any chance of encountering Blackwell and his men. As they rode, Sarah explained her suspicion. "My uncle mentioned some papers about water rights," she said. "The creek that runs through the Miller property also feeds Blackwell's land, but there was some dispute about who controlled the water during drought years. Uncle said he had documentation that gave him primary rights. And without those papers, Blackwell could claim the water for himself," Xander concluded, "especially if he manages to buy the Miller land from you." "Exactly," Sarah nodded, "and a ranch without reliable water isn't worth much." They pushed their horses harder, reaching the outskirts of San Jose as the sun was beginning to set. The town was quiet, with most people at home for evening meals or gathering in the saloons. "Where would your uncle keep important papers?" Xander asked as they approached the livery. "He had a strongbox," Sarah replied, "but it wasn't at the ranch. He didn't trust keeping valuables there after they had a break-in last year." "Where then?" "The bank, most likely," Sarah said, "or possibly with his lawyer, Mr. Hargrove. His office is on Main Street." They stabled their horses and headed directly to the lawyer's office, only to find it closed for the day. A sign in the window indicated he'd return at 9 the following morning. "We'll have to wait," Sarah said, frustration evident in her voice. "But Blackwell might realize we've been to the ranch. He could come looking for us." "Let's get you somewhere safe for the night," Xander suggested. "Somewhere Blackwell wouldn't think to look." Sarah considered for a moment. "There's a widow who lives at the edge of town, Mrs. Fletcher. She was friends with my aunt. She'd take me in without asking questions." "Perfect," Xander agreed. "I'll escort you there, then return to my room at the general store. If Blackwell comes looking, I want him to find me, not you." Sarah looked alarmed. "That's too dangerous." "The man's clearly willing to kill to get what he wants." "I can handle myself," Xander assured her, "and we need to keep him distracted until we can secure those papers tomorrow." They made their way cautiously through the darkening streets to Mrs. Fletcher's modest home. The elderly woman welcomed Sarah warmly, asking no questions when she requested a place to stay for the night. Xander declined the invitation to come inside, conscious of maintaining Sarah's reputation. "I'll meet you at Hargrove's office at 9, he told her quietly at the door. "Be careful." "You too," Sarah replied, her eyes betraying her concern. "Xander, thank you for believing me, for helping me." "We're not done yet," he reminded her with a gentle smile, "but we're getting closer to the truth." The walk back to his room above the general store gave Xander time to consider their next steps. If they could secure the water rights documentation, they'd have evidence of Blackwell's motive. Combined with the distinctive horseshoe print matching the tracks at the accident site, it might be enough to convince the sheriff to investigate. As he approached the general store, Xander noticed 2 horses he didn't recognize tied at the hitching post. One was the gray gelding with the chipped shoe. His hand moved to his revolver as he slowed his pace, scanning the shadows around the building. "Looking for someone, Cowboy?" a voice drawled from the darkness beside the store. Xander turned slowly to face one of Blackwell's men stepping out of the shadows, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "Just heading to my room," Xander replied calmly. "Don't want any trouble." "Funny thing," the man said, moving closer. "Mr. Blackwell says you've been making trouble. Says you were snooping around the Miller place today." "Don't know what you're talking about." Xander maintained his composed facade despite the danger. "I was out riding, getting the lay of the land, looking for work." A second man emerged from the other side of the building, the one who had been riding the gray horse. "He's lying, Tom. I saw him and that Linden woman watching us from the barn." "Where is she?" the first man, Tom, demanded. "Blackwell wants to speak with her." "Don't know any Linden woman," Xander insisted, his mind racing. He needed to keep their attention on him and away from Sarah. "Like I said, I was just riding, getting to know the area." Tom's patience visibly thinned. Blackwell doesn't like liars or snoops, Cowboy, and neither do I. His hand moved toward his gun. Xander's reaction was instantaneous. He drew and fired in one fluid motion, catching Tom in the shoulder before he could clear his holster. The second man managed to draw, but Xander had already thrown himself sideways, rolling behind a water trough as gunfire erupted. The commotion brought people running, shouts and screams filling the night air. Xander caught a glimpse of the second man leaping onto his gray horse and galloping away, leaving his wounded companion behind. Within minutes, the sheriff arrived, a stern-faced man named Hollister who quickly took control of the scene. Tom was disarmed and his wound tended to while Xander explained what had happened. They were waiting for me, he concluded. Mentioned Emmett Blackwell sent them. Sheriff Hollister frowned. Blackwell's got influence in this county, Lowell, not someone you want as an enemy. Didn't choose him as one, Xander replied evenly, but I won't stand by while his men try to gun me down in the street. Tom was taken to the doctor's office under guard, and Xander found himself recounting the story again at the sheriff's office. He carefully omitted any mention of Sarah or their investigation, presenting it as an unprovoked attack. "You're staying in town?" Hollister asked when Xander had finished. "For now," Xander confirmed, "looking for ranch work." "Well, I'd suggest you either find it quick or move on," the sheriff advised. "Blackwell won't take kindly to one of his men being shot." "I understand," Xander said, standing to leave, "but I didn't start this, Sheriff, I just finished it." Sleep was impossible that night. Xander sat by the window of his room, revolver ready, watching the street below for any sign of Blackwell's return. His thoughts kept returning to Sarah, her determination, her courage, and the flash of connection he'd felt between them on the ride back to town. Dawn was breaking when he finally dozed off in the chair, only to be awakened by a knock at his door 2 hours later. He approached cautiously, gun in hand. "Who is it?" he called. "It's me," Sarah's voice replied. "Are you all right? I heard about the shooting." Xander opened the door to find her looking pale and worried, dressed in a simple blue calico dress with her hair neatly pinned up. Relief washed over her face when she saw him unharmed. "I'm fine," he assured her, holstering his weapon. "News travels fast, Mrs. Fletcher heard it from the milkman," Sarah explained, stepping inside when he gestured her in. "He said you shot one of Blackwell's men." "He didn't give me much choice," Xander said grimly. "They were waiting for me. They knew we'd been at the ranch." Sarah's eyes widened. "Did they mention me?" "Yes, but I denied knowing you," Xander replied. "I don't think they know where you're staying, but we should be careful. It's nearly 9. Let's head to Hargrove's office." They left separately, with Xander following at a distance to ensure they weren't being watched. The lawyer's office was open when they arrived. A small brass plaque identifying Hargrove and Associates, attorneys at law, on the door. Inside, they found a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, sorting through correspondence at a cluttered desk. He looked up as they entered, recognition lighting his face when he saw Sarah. "Miss Linden," he said, standing to greet her. "I was so sorry to hear about your family, a terrible tragedy." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," Sarah replied. "This is my friend, Mr. Lowell. We need to speak with you about an urgent matter." Hargrove ushered them into his private office and closed the door. "How can I be of service?" "My uncle mentioned having papers regarding water rights for the ranch," Sarah explained. "Important documents that establish the miller's primary claim to the creek water." "Ah, yes," Hargrove nodded. "The riparian rights agreement. Your uncle was quite concerned about protecting those rights, especially given Mr. Blackwell's repeated attempts to challenge them." "Do you have those documents?" Xander asked directly. "I do," the lawyer confirmed. "Mr. Miller entrusted them to my safekeeping some months ago, along with his will and other important papers." Relief flooded Sarah's face. "We need to see them, Mr. Hargrove. It's very important." The lawyer hesitated. "May I ask why the sudden interest? The property is secure in your name according to the will." Sarah glanced at Xander, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath before explaining their suspicions about Blackwell's involvement in the accident. Hargrove listened with growing concern. When Sarah mentioned the distinctive horseshoe print matching the tracks at the accident site, his face paled visibly. "This is a very serious accusation," he said gravely when she had finished. "Blackwell is a powerful man in this county." "We know," Xander acknowledged, "but if he caused the deaths of Sarah's family to gain control of their water rights, he needs to face justice." Hargrove removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "I must admit, I've had my own concerns about the timing of the accident. Especially when Blackwell approached me the very next day, inquiring about the water rights documentation." "He came to you?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Indeed, wanted to know if I had the papers in my possession. When I confirmed that I did, he seemed disappointed. Said he'd be in touch with you about purchasing the property." "Which he was," Sarah confirmed, barely waiting until after the funeral. Hargrove rose and went to a large safe in the corner of the office. After working the combination, he extracted a leather portfolio and returned to the desk. "Here," he said, spreading several documents before them. "The original survey maps showing the creek's course and the legal agreement establishing the miller's primary water rights during drought conditions." Xander and Sarah examined the papers carefully. The agreement was clear: the millers had first claim to the creek water, with Blackwell's rights secondary. "In a drought year like this one," Hargrove explained, "this agreement would allow the millers to use as much water as needed for their cattle and crops before Blackwell could divert any for his own use." "And without these documents?" Sarah asked. "Standard water law would apply equal rights to adjoining property owners," Hargrove replied. "Given the size of Blackwell's operation compared to the Miller Ranch, he would argue for a proportional division that would favor him significantly." "So he had motive," Xander concluded. "Strong motive." "Motive, yes," Hargrove agreed, "but proving he caused the accident would be extraordinarily difficult without a witness." "What about the horseshoe evidence?" Sarah pressed. "Circumstantial at best," the lawyer said regretfully. "You'd need more to convince Sheriff Hollister to act against someone of Blackwell's standing." They left Hargrove's office with copies of the water rights documents, but no clearer path to justice. Walking slowly down Main Street, they debated their next steps. "We need more evidence," Xander said. "Or a witness who saw something that day." "The double-cross hands found the wreckage," Sarah reminded him, "but they didn't see what happened." Xander stopped suddenly, a memory clicking into place. "Wait. Dawson said they found tracks near the scene, but what if someone else was there before them? Someone who saw what happened but was afraid to come forward." "Like who?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Xander admitted, "but it's worth asking around. People see things, especially in open country." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a wagon rattling down the street, driven by a weather-beaten old man with a long white beard. He reined in his team when he spotted Sarah. "Miss Linden," he called out, "been looking for you." "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah greeted him. "What brings you to town?" Jenkins was a hermit who lived in a cabin in the hills north of San Jose, occasionally coming to town for supplies. Xander had heard of him but never met the man. "Heard about your family," Jenkins said, his rheumy eyes sad. "Meant to come to the funeral, but my rheumatism was acting up something fierce. Just wanted to say how sorry I was." "Thank you," Sarah said gently. "That's kind of you." Jenkins glanced at Xander curiously. "Who's your friend?" "Xander Lowell," he introduced himself, offering his hand. "New in town." The old man's hand was calloused, but his grip surprisingly strong. "Lowell, heard that name. Weren't you the one they said spooked the Miller team?" Xander tensed, but answered honestly. "That's what some people say, but it wasn't me. I was 50 miles away when it happened." Jenkins studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Figured as much. Man I saw didn't look much like you, except maybe your build and that black hat." Sarah gasped, grabbing the old man's arm. "Mr. Jenkins, are you saying you saw what happened to my family's wagon?" The old man looked suddenly uncomfortable, glancing around the street. "Shouldn't talk about such things out in the open, Miss Linden. Some folks don't appreciate witnesses." "Please," Sarah implored him. "This is important." Jenkins hesitated, then nodded toward the end of the street. "Meet me behind the feed store in 10 minutes. Better not to be seen talking too long." They watched as he continued down the street, turning his wagon toward the general store. Xander and Sarah exchanged a significant look. A witness, Sarah breathed. An actual witness. If he's telling the truth, Xander cautioned, and if he actually saw enough to identify who was responsible. They made their way casually to the feed store, circling around to the back where stacks of hay bales provided privacy from the street. Jenkins joined them a few minutes later, his expression guarded. "What did you see that day, Mr. Jenkins?" Sarah asked directly. The old man removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I was up in the hills, checking my traps. Have a spot overlooking the road where your folks' wagon went over. Saw the whole thing." "Tell us," Xander urged gently. "Ryder came up behind the wagon fast," Jenkins recounted. "Wearing a black hat and duster, fired a shot in the air right behind the team. Horses panicked, bolted. Saw the wagon veer off the road and go over. Terrible thing to witness." Sarah's face had gone white. "Did you see the rider's face?" Jenkins shook his head. "Too far away for that, but I recognized the horse, that gray with the white blaze that Blackwell's foreman rides. And I saw which way he headed after, straight back to Blackwell's ranch." "Blackwell's foreman," Xander repeated. "The man who was with him at the Miller ranch yesterday, the one riding the gray with the chipped shoe." "That'd be Cal Hardin," Jenkins confirmed. "Mean sort. Been working for Blackwell going on 5 years now." "Why didn't you tell anyone what you saw?" Sarah asked, her voice strained. Jenkins looked down. "Blackwell's got influence, Miss Linden. Man like me speaks up against him, might find myself in trouble, or worse." "Would you be willing to tell Sheriff Hollister what you saw?" Xander asked. "With the horseshoe evidence and the water rights motive, your testimony could be enough." The old man hesitated, clearly torn. "I don't know. Blackwell ain't a man to cross lightly." "He killed my family," Sarah said quietly. "Please, Mr. Jenkins, help us bring them justice." Jenkins studied her face for a long moment before squaring his shoulders. "All right, for Henry Miller and his family, I'll speak to Hollister." They made their way to the sheriff's office, finding Hollister at his desk reviewing wanted posters. The sheriff looked up in surprise as the unlikely trio entered. "Miss Linden," he acknowledged with a nod. "Lowell and Jenkins, isn't it? Don't often see you in town twice in a month." "Got something important to tell you, Sheriff," Jenkins said, his voice stronger than it had been in the alley. "About the Miller wagon accident." Hollister's eyebrows rose, but he gestured for them to sit. "I'm listening." Over the next hour, they presented their case: the water rights dispute that gave Blackwell motive, the distinctive horseshoe print matching Hardin's mount, and finally, Jenkins' eyewitness account of seeing Hardin deliberately spook the Miller team. When they finished, Hollister leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "That's quite a story, and serious accusations against prominent citizens." "It's the truth, Sheriff," Sarah insisted. "Will you arrest Hardin and Blackwell if he ordered it?" "Evidence against Hardin seems substantial," Hollister admitted. "Particularly with Jenkins' testimony. Blackwell is another matter. No direct evidence he ordered anything." "He had the most to gain," Xander pointed out. "Motive isn't proof," Hollister countered. "But I'll bring Hardin in for questioning, see if he implicates his boss." It was more than they'd hoped for, but less than they wanted. As they left the sheriff's office, Sarah's expression was a mixture of relief and frustration. "At least Hardin will face justice," Xander offered. "If Hollister actually arrests him," Sarah replied skeptically. "And if Blackwell doesn't help him disappear before that happens." Jenkins headed back to his wagon, promising to return the next day if the sheriff needed his formal statement. Xander and Sarah walked slowly toward the Painted Lady Saloon, where Sarah was due to begin her shift. "What will you do now?" Xander asked as they approached the saloon. "Keep working," Sarah replied, "and wait to see if Hollister follows through." She paused, looking up at him. "What about you?" "Still planning to move on when this is settled." Before Xander could answer, a commotion down the street caught their attention. Emmett Blackwell and 4 men, including the wounded Tom with his arm in a sling, were approaching the sheriff's office. Blackwell's face was thunderous. "Looks like word travels fast," Xander observed grimly. "Hollister must have sent someone to inform Blackwell they were bringing Hardin in. Or someone overheard us in the office, Sarah suggested. Either way, Blackwell knows we're onto him. They watched as the group disappeared into the sheriff's office. Moments later, raised voices could be heard even from where they stood. "This could get ugly," Xander said. "You should get inside, out of sight." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I'm not hiding. This is about my family." Before they could debate further, the sheriff's door burst open and Blackwell emerged, his face red with fury. His eyes scanned the street until they locked on Sarah and Xander. With determined strides, he headed straight for them, his men following close behind. "Linden," he bellowed. "You've got a lot of nerve, girl, spreading lies about me and my men." Xander stepped slightly in front of Sarah, his hand near his holstered revolver. "They're not lies, Blackwell. Jenkins saw what happened." "That old fool," Blackwell scoffed. "He's half blind and addled in the head. No jury would believe him over respectable ranchers." "Maybe not," Sarah said, stepping forward to stand beside Xander. "But they might believe the evidence, the horseshoe print, the water rights dispute, the fact that you tried to buy my land before my family was even in the ground." Blackwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're making a mistake, girl. That land should be part of my ranch. It's worthless to you." "It was my family's home," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "And it's not for sale, not to you, not ever." The standoff had drawn attention. Townspeople were gathering at a safe distance, watching the confrontation. Blackwell seemed to notice the audience and moderated his tone slightly. "You think you can run that ranch alone?" he asked with a sneer. "A woman with no experience." "You'll be bankrupt within a year." "She won't be alone," Xander said firmly. "And Hollister's bringing Hardin in for questioning. Your foreman might decide saving his own neck is more important than protecting you." A flash of uncertainty crossed Blackwell's face before he masked it with renewed anger. "You're making powerful enemies, Lowell. Both of you are. Better that than standing by while murderers go unpunished," Xander replied evenly. Blackwell's hand twitched toward his gun, but with so many witnesses, he clearly thought better of it. Instead, he spat on the ground at their feet. "This isn't over," he growled before turning and stalking away, his men following reluctantly behind. Sarah released a shaky breath as they watched the group retreat. "That was terrifying," she admitted. "But you stood your ground," Xander said with admiration. "Your family would be proud." She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "You said I wouldn't be alone. Did you mean that?" Xander held her gaze steadily. "I did. If you want my help, that is." A commotion from the direction of the sheriff's office interrupted them again. Hollister was emerging with 2 deputies, all mounted and armed. "They're heading to Blackwell's ranch," Xander surmised. "To arrest Hardin before he can disappear." "Will they succeed?" Sarah wondered. "Depends on whether Hardin values loyalty over his own neck," Xander replied, "and whether Blackwell has already helped him flee." The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation. Sarah worked her shift at the saloon while Xander kept watch, alert for any sign of Blackwell or his men returning to town. The saloon was buzzing with talk of the confrontation and Hollister's ride to the Blackwell ranch. It was nearly dusk when Hollister and his deputies returned, a sullen Cal Hardin riding between them with his hands bound to his saddle horn. The sight sent a ripple of excitement through the saloon. "They got him," Sarah whispered to Xander as they watched through the window. "I can hardly believe it. Hollister's a better man than I gave him credit for," Xander admitted. "Standing up to Blackwell couldn't have been easy." As night fell, the saloon grew increasingly crowded. Jenkins arrived, accepting Xander's offer of a drink, and they were soon joined by Hank Dawson and several other double-cross hands. "Heard you found yourself a witness, Lowell," Dawson said, nodding toward Jenkins. "Good work." "Just wanted the truth," Xander replied, "for Sarah's family." Dawson studied him thoughtfully. "Truth's a rare commodity in these parts. Most folks prefer a convenient lie." "Not me," Xander said firmly. "Never did." The evening wore on, with more people arriving as news of Hardin's arrest spread. Just before midnight, Sheriff Hollister himself entered the saloon, immediately causing a hush to fall over the crowd. "Evening, folks," he greeted, removing his hat as he approached the bar. "Figured I'd find you here, Miss Linden. You too, Lowell." Sheriff, Sarah acknowledged. Is it true you arrested Cal Hardin? Hollister nodded, accepting the whiskey Morgan poured him. In custody now and talking. Talking, Xander asked, hope rising in his chest. Seems Hardin doesn't fancy hanging alone, Hollister explained. Claims Blackwell ordered him to scare the Miller team, not send them over the edge. Says it was supposed to look like an accident that the Millers survived just enough to frighten them into selling. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, but something went wrong. Road was narrower than Hardin expected, Hollister confirmed grimly. Team panicked more than he anticipated. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late, and Blackwell, Xander pressed. Denies everything, of course, Hollister said, knocking back his whiskey. Says Hardin's lying to save himself, but with Jenkins' testimony and the physical evidence. Well, the circuit judge arrives next week. Both men will stand trial. Relief washed over Sarah's face, and she reached unconsciously for Xander's hand. Thank you, Sheriff, she said sincerely. For believing us. Hollister nodded, his weathered face solemn. Justice isn't always convenient, Miss Linden, but it matters. He glanced at Xander. You planning to stay in these parts, Lowell? The question hung in the air between them. Xander looked at Sarah, still holding his hand, her eyes reflecting the same question. I believe I am, Sheriff, he said finally. Found some reasons to stay. As the saloon returned to its normal bustle of conversation and activity, Xander and Sarah stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, the moon casting silver light over the sleeping town. Did you mean that? Sarah asked quietly. About staying? I did, Xander replied. If that's what you want. Sarah turned to face him fully. The ranch is too much for me to manage alone. I could use a partner, someone who knows cattle, someone I trust. Is that all you're offering? Xander asked, his voice low. A business arrangement. Even in the moonlight, he could see the color rise in her cheeks. No, she admitted, not just business. In these past days, I've come to care for you, Xander, more than I expected to. Xander reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. I've been riding from place to place for years, never finding a reason to put down roots, but now, Sarah prompted when he paused. Now I've found something worth staying for, he finished simply. Someone worth building a future with. Sarah's smile was radiant in the moonlight. The Miller Ranch could use a good man, and I could use. She hesitated, then finished boldly, a good husband. Xander's heart swelled at her words. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepening as Sarah responded, her arms coming up to encircle his neck. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Xander rested his forehead against hers. I saw the truth about Blackwell, he murmured, and I see the truth about us too. I love you, Sarah Linden. And I love you, Xander Lowell, she replied softly. My cowboy who wouldn't rest until the truth was known. The following week brought the circuit judge to San Jose, and with him, the trial of Emmett Blackwell and Cal Hardin. The courthouse was packed as Jenkins testified to what he'd witnessed, his voice growing stronger and more confident as he recounted the events of that fateful day. Hardin, facing the prospect of hanging, confirmed every detail, admitting that Blackwell had ordered him to frighten the Millers into selling, but that the plan had gone tragically wrong. Despite Blackwell's expensive lawyer and protestations of innocence, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts for both men. Hardin for the deaths themselves, Blackwell for orchestrating the plan that led to them. The judge sentenced Hardin to 20 years hard labor and Blackwell to hang. As they left the courthouse, Sarah leaned against Xander's side, emotionally drained but finally at peace. It won't bring them back, she said quietly, but at least justice was done. Your family would be proud of you, Xander assured her, his arm around her shoulders. You didn't give up, even when it would have been easier. They walked together through the town, nodding to those who offered congratulations or sympathetic words. Word of their engagement had spread quickly after Xander had formally proposed the night after Hardin's arrest, presenting Sarah with a simple gold band he'd purchased from the general store. What now? Sarah asked as they reached the livery where their horses were stabled. The ranch needs so much work to get it running properly again. We start small, Xander suggested. Focus on repairing the main house and outbuildings first, round up whatever cattle are still on the range, hire a couple of good hands. Sarah nodded, her practical nature already calculating costs and timelines. The water rights are secure, which means we'll have an advantage during dry years. And there's that south pasture that my uncle always said would be perfect for breeding stock. Xander smiled at her enthusiasm. Sounds like you've been thinking about this. I have, she admitted. I want to make it everything my aunt and uncle dreamed it could be, a legacy they would be proud of. We will, Xander promised, together. 2 days later, they rode out to the Miller ranch, their ranch now, with a wagon loaded with supplies and the personal belongings Sarah had accumulated during her stay in town. The journey was bittersweet for Sarah, memories of her family mingling with hopes for the future. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Xander reined in his horse beside hers, taking in the view. The main house stood solid against the backdrop of rolling hills, the creek gleaming silver in the afternoon sun as it wound through the property. It's beautiful, he said sincerely. I can see why your family loved it. Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. It is, and it will be again. They rode down to the house together, their future stretching before them like the open land. There would be challenges ahead, hard work, drought years, the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers, but they would face them side by side. As they unloaded the wagon and began the process of making the house livable again, Xander found himself pausing occasionally to watch Sarah. Her determination, her strength in the face of tragedy, and the gentle heart beneath her practical exterior had captured him completely. He knew with absolute certainty that his days of drifting were over. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, they sat together on the porch steps, shoulders touching as they watched darkness settle over their land. I never thought I'd find a home again after my parents died, Sarah said softly. Then Aunt Martha and Uncle Henry took me in, and I thought perhaps I had, when they died. Her voice caught. I understand, Xander said, taking her hand. I've been rootless since my father passed, never letting myself get too attached to any place or person. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. And now I've found where I belong, he replied simply. With you, on this land. 3 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in San Jose with Mrs. Fletcher, Jenkins, and a handful of friends in attendance. Sarah wore her aunt's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slimmer frame, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow behind their house. As they exchanged vows, Xander looked into Sarah's eyes and saw their future reflected, their children running through the fields, cattle grazing on the hillsides, and years of building something meaningful together. The Miller Lowell Ranch quickly developed a reputation for quality stock and fair dealing. Xander's expertise with horses complemented Sarah's head for business, and together they gradually expanded their holdings, adding adjacent land when it became available and improving their breeding stock. 2 years after their wedding, their first child was born, a son they named Henry, after Sarah's uncle. As Xander held his newborn son, wrapped in a soft blanket Sarah had quilted during the winter evenings, he felt a completeness he had never known was possible. He has your eyes, Sarah said tiredly from the bed, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. And your determination, Xander replied, watching as the tiny fist waved in defiance of its swaddling. He'll be a handful, Sarah laughed softly. Good thing we're both stubborn enough to handle him. As the years passed, the ranch prospered and their family grew. A daughter, Martha, joined them 2 years after Henry, followed by another son, Thomas, named for Sarah's cousin. The children grew up strong and capable, learning the ways of ranch life from their parents and developing the same sense of justice and truth that had brought Xander and Sarah together. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Xander surprised Sarah with a special gift, a new sign for the ranch entrance, carved from oak and painted in bold letters. Truth Creek Ranch. Sarah's eyes filled with tears when she saw it. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the smooth wood reverently. "Seemed fitting," Xander said, his arm around her waist. "Since truth is what brought us together, what saved this place." The children, now old enough to understand the story of how their parents met, gathered around to admire the sign. Henry, serious beyond his 8 years, looked up at his father. "Is that why you always tell us to speak the truth, Pa, because of what happened with Blackwell?" Xander knelt to meet his son's eyes. "Partly, but also because truth is like this land's solid ground you can build on. Lies are like quicksand, they might seem to hold you up for a while, but eventually they'll drag you down." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Xander sat on the porch swing, just as they had done nearly every evening for the past decade. The ranch was quiet, peaceful under the canopy of stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Staying here?" Giving up the freedom of the trail, Xander considered her question seriously. "Not for a moment," he replied honestly. "I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was to belong somewhere, with someone." Sarah nestled closer to him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "Remember what you said that day in town, after Hardin was arrested?" "I said a lot of things that day," Xander smiled. "Which part are you thinking of?" "You said, I saw the truth about Blackwell, and I see the truth about us too," Sarah reminded him. "It's always stayed with me how certain you sounded." Xander's arm tightened around her. "I was certain, some truths you just know deep in your bones." As they sat together under the star-filled sky, surrounded by the land they had nurtured and the home they had built, Xander reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. A false accusation that had led to the greatest truth of his life, the love he shared with Sarah. The cowboy who had once drifted from town to town, always moving on before connections could form, had found his true north in a woman's amber eyes and the promise of a shared future. In clearing his name, he had found so much more: a purpose, a family, a legacy to pass on to their children. And in the quiet moments like this, with Sarah beside him and their children sleeping safely inside, Xander knew with absolute certainty that he had found the truth that mattered most, the truth of where he belonged.